From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking about Syria and the uneasy triangle between Turkey, the US, and the Syrian Kurdish militia known as the People's Protection Units, or YPG. Turkey and the US recently announced an agreement to work towards establishing a so-called safe zone in northern Syria. This would serve as a buffer between Turkey and the YPG, which Ankara considers a terrorist group, but with which Washington has long-standing security ties as part of the fight against ISIS. To discuss the agreement and what it might mean for dynamics on the ground, I'm joined by Gonul, the director of MEI's Turkey program, and Charles Lister, the head of MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program and a longtime Syria watcher. Gonul, Charles, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Gonul, let's start with you. The establishment of a safe zone in northern Syria has long been a Turkish priority and a major issue on the bilateral agenda with the US. What prompted the recent agreement, and what do we know about the details?
Well, in the last few years, Turkey launched 2 military incursions into northern Syria to drive back the Syrian Kurdish militia from the border. And Erdogan recently said a third incursion into northeastern Syria, where hundreds of U.S. troops are stationed, is imminent. And there were some people in Washington who argued that Erdogan said these things before and that he was bluffing. And they were right. Erdogan did say those things before, in December of last year, for instance. But I think the context was different then. So I think he was serious this time because domestically he's very vulnerable. He recently lost local elections in March and then later the Istanbul rerun elections in June. Former party leaders are launching their own parties. That is a huge problem for Erdogan. And also Turkish economy is struggling. So he needs to mobilize the nationalists to close the ranks and stop the bleeding. And another difference is that he is now more confident in his relationship with President Trump. In December, for instance, when Erdogan made such threats, President Trump stood firm in his support for the Syrian Kurdish militia, threatening Turkey to devastate its economy if Turkey went ahead and attacked the Kurds. This time, President Trump was mute. And also, he went to great lengths to side with Turkey on the question of Russian missile defense system, the S-400s. So in Erdogan's thinking, he could launch a military incursion into northeastern Syria and would not get a strong reaction from Washington this time. So I think that was the thinking, and the Americans figured that out, that he was serious this time. And also from Erdogan's perspective, as much as he wants this military incursion, he's aware of the risks of a unilateral military incursion. If an American soldier accidentally gets killed or if violence flares up, that would mean that it would make very difficult for President Trump to keep standing by Turkey, because the Congress feels very strongly about the sanctions and very frustrated with Turkish actions.
On the agreement itself, it seems like it left a lot of the details still to be filled in later on. What happens next, and what are likely to be the main points of contention when Turkey and the U.S. actually get down to kind of hashing those out?
Well, in terms of the details, we don't know much because the language of the statements released by the two governments was quite vague. They only said that the two parties had agreed to address Turkish security concerns and that they would work on the establishment of a safe zone in northern Syria. But as you said, they left out key details such as the statement doesn't really address the thorniest issue, which is the size and complexion of the safe zone. And in terms of what comes next, I think for now a Turkish military incursion has been averted, and I think with this agreement the two sides agreed to kick the can down the road. But I think eventually disagreements will flare up because the agreement itself doesn't really serve the interests of all parties involved. First of all, a deep zone, which is promoted by Turkey, that is around 32 kilometers. I believe it's around 20 miles, which is off limits to the YPG forces. That really deals a blow to what U.S. wants to do in that part of the region, which is preventing the resurgence of ISIS and also thwarting Iranian influence there. And second, it's unlikely for the Syrian Kurdish militia to agree to withdraw from an area that deep. Before, they had agreed that they were willing to withdraw from a 5-kilometer zone. But if this is much deeper, I think it's unlikely for them to agree to those. So I think all these things and the vagueness of the deal, the language of the deal itself reminds me of a previous deal that was reached between Turkey and the United States, which is the Manbij deal. Manbij is another northern Syrian town. The US and Turks had reached an agreement there, and part of the agreement was to make sure that the YPG is cleared of the area. So it was reached on paper, and yet it wasn't fully implemented. So I think same fate is awaiting this deal.
What's your read on the announcement, Charles? What are your kind of thoughts on the prospects, and what would it mean for the Syrian Kurds in particular?
Well, I think at the outset, it was a deal to agree that there will be a deal. And so, yes, the devil's in the details, which have yet to be agreed. I think the core, though, is, to look at it from an American perspective and to look at it strategically, it's quite clear to me that the US needs there to be a deal. If there isn't a deal, everything falls apart, and we'll have an excuse to give the president to issue a directive to depart Syria, which the Trump administration quite clearly doesn't want to do. So there's a reason why the US has continued to engage in these negotiations, and it's because we do really need a deal. My understanding of the negotiations is that the American negotiating position is the one that has moved, and it's the Turkish one that hasn't. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to agree to the Turkish position. We certainly are not. But it is interesting to see that it's the Americans that have budged and not the Turks. Now, whilst the deal had the 3 components, or the 3 bullet points, which were fairly vague, again, my understanding is that there have been certain kind of core concepts that have been agreed, which is that there will be a zone. It will probably be split into 2. There'll be a slim zone within which the YPG will have to leave, and then there'll be a broader zone within which heavy weapons will have to be removed, a sort of demilitarized zone. I'm told both the US and Turkey have agreed in principle to that concept. What needs to be agreed is the depth of those 2 zones and how wide it is. So at the moment, the American proposal is to do this in a sequenced way. So rather than encompassing the entire northern border of Syria with Turkey, it will start with roughly 100 kilometers from the Euphrates River, over 100 kilometers, and then steadily stretch over across to Turkey's southeastern border. Those things haven't been agreed. What has been agreed as well, though, is that there will be a coordination center in Ankara. There will be a kind of operations room in southeastern Turkey that is already somewhat in action. 6 American DoD personnel are already there. The Ankara negotiations are continuing, though at a lower level. There have been reports this week of Turkish unarmed drones now already flying over that territory. So there's some rumor, at least, that was one of the initial accepted proposals that the Turks had made that we have already said yes to, is that the Turks can fly unarmed drones over northeastern Syria, over some batch of territory for reconnaissance purposes. So clearly more has been agreed than what has been announced publicly. There's a reason for that because of how sensitive this issue is. The big challenge is what happens next. As Gonul said, it does sound a lot like Manbij. It is a sequenced proposal. It is something that is designed to take a long time to implement. The trouble with that is Turkey has watched the Manbij proposal not be implemented. They've already made it patently clear that if this looks like Manbij to us again, then we will intervene. And that is an existential crisis for the US. The second the Turks intervene, as of now, there's actually very little we could do to push back against it. I was on the Hill last week. There is no consensus on the Hill that Congress would give us any authority to push back against a Turkish military incursion into northeastern Syria. In other words, we would have to stand back and watch. And the second that happens, our relationship with the SDF begins to rapidly erode. The proposal of them re-engaging with Damascus goes back on the table. And then our status in Syria is right back in a very big question mark. And so this is critical for the US, but we're unable to provide very few details whilst our partner has a maximalist position, just as Turkey does. That's the crisis that we're in.
But also, if I may, yes, maybe the Congress might not give authority to defend the Syrian Kurds, but the Congress has other tools. I think the CATSA sanctions are still on the table. So that could be a reminder to Erdogan to be cautious when he considers a military incursion, unilateral military incursion.
I would still be amazed if the Turks carried through with some of their maximalist words or threats. It is still possible that an Arab majority town like Tel Abyad would be an initial incursion to send us a message. Again, we wouldn't do anything to stop that. And an added element I just wanted to throw in terms of the Turkish mix is also there's the issue of, why has Turkey conducted these incursions? It's been really for two reasons. It's been to fight the PKK, but it's also been to establish areas of territory in which Syrian refugees currently in Turkey can return. And that is also, as Gonul knows, a crisis issue in Turkish politics. And it's something that Erdogan has to show progress in. And that's where the Northeast presents this immense potential value for Turkey. They've sucked up the amount of potential they can west of the Euphrates, and only east of the Euphrates can they continue to expand that kind of zone.
On that point, Gonul, there have been reports recently that the government in Turkey has begun deporting some refugees, some of the 3.5 million refugees, Syrian refugees in Turkey to Idlib, to other areas. Would the establishment of the safe zone really ramp that up?
Well, certainly that's what President Erdogan has in mind. As Charles said, that has become the issue of the presence of millions of Syrian refugees has become a hot potato in Turkish politics. And I think that was one of the top reasons why President Erdogan lost local elections. So it is a very significant problem for President Erdogan. And he hopes that a safe zone along Turkish-Syrian border, which could host Turkey's millions of Syrian refugees, could fix that problem. But of course, when you're talking about setting up a safe zone in another country, you have to consider, first, it will have significant political and military implications for the larger Syrian conflict, which means that you really have to consider what other actors will say. Countries like Russia, for instance, won't just sit back and allow this to happen, because particularly for Russia, the word safe zone is a code word for regime change because of the Libyan experience. So I think this is a very complicated problem. And second, if you are going to establish a safe zone that will host millions of people, you just want to make sure that it is actually a safe zone, that it doesn't become a target of the regime or the regime allies. So it is a very complicated question. And also, I think, again, we recently, General Joe Votel and I co-authored a piece in which we argued that the safe zone will not really fix the problems of all parties involved. First, I think the YPG has not really used northern Syria to stage attacks against Turkey, and that's particularly because of the U.S. pressure on the YPG. That would be shooting themselves in the foot. That would put the U.S. cooperation with YPG in an even more difficult position. So I think largely for that reason, they have refrained from staging attacks. So that hasn't really been a real security concern for Turkey. And a zone as deep as 20 miles will certainly deal a huge blow to what the U.S. wants to do in northern Syria, which is preventing the resurgence of ISIS, and second, curbing Iranian influence there. And third, I think, again, it will create a safe zone means a safe zone where there is no conflict, and a zone as deep as what Turks have been pushing for could actually do the opposite, because it will certainly displace 90% of the Kurds living there, which will create more conflict, which will require more militarization in that area. So I don't think it will fix anyone's problems.
I think just to add in here, I think what Gonul says underlines precisely why the US has to come to some kind of an agreement here. There's no way we'll ever agree to Turkey's proposals, and a unilateral Turkish incursion that does go as deep as they're threatening still sounds to me like a fantasy. I don't think Turkey is willing to risk enough or that much to accomplish a zone that deep unilaterally, with the risk of fighting the US, with the risk of aggravating Russia. And, with Russia now, a subject on the table, I think Russia is quite happy to sit back and watch this play out. In some ways, a Turkish zone, however small or big, in northeastern Syria actually seems to be in Russia's interest. The inflaming of tensions, the eruption potentially of ethnic or sectarian conflict places the US under great strain, will, at least with our current political leadership here in Washington, give Donald Trump an opportunity to say we're getting out. That is in Russia's interests there. Then the SDF is weaker, then the US is weaker, then Turkey has to make a deal. When we've looked at Russia's proposals in the past vis-a-vis the SDF, like in Afrin, before Turkey intervened, the Russians offered the SDF a deal whereby the Turks would be banned from intervening across the border into Afrin in exchange for Russian protection. But what was the offer? Effectively a total SDF surrender to the regime. That isn't going to be something that the SDF are going to accept in the northeast, but it might have to be something they would have to accept if this worst case scenario plays out. So all of this underlines why I don't think Russia is going to do anything right now. They're very happy to watch this play out. The Russians don't have anything to offer the SDF, and that places all of the onus on the US to guarantee that some form of a deal is made. Because if it isn't, we lose. The SDF loses and everyone else gains, and that doesn't seem to be a particularly logical path.
On a practical level, Charles, does the U.S. have enough troops in northeastern Syria to continue both the fight against ISIS as well as managing a safe zone if we do manage to come to a deal with the Turks?
Frankly speaking, no. For even putting the safe zone out of the question for a minute, I don't think we have enough troops to accomplish the kind of objectives that we've set ourselves. An enduring defeat of ISIS requires still a relatively significant effort on our part, as well as obviously an even heavier effort on the part of the SDF, our local partner force. If you look at the Department of Defense just recently released a quarterly report on the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And although it wasn't said explicitly, the overarching messages were really two. One of them was ISIS is already resurgent in Syria, and the main reasons for that is that the US has chosen to focus more on Iran, and in so doing, it has also withdrawn troops from Syria. So the message is we do still need more troops. We've halved our numbers in the last year. So as the message was, we need to be back at our previous force levels of 2,000 to 2,500, not 1,000. And we need to be placing much more focus on continuing the struggle against ISIS because they're far from gone. So with the safe zone in mind, then obviously that's going to require some more focus. Although if you look at the US proposals, it doesn't actually seem to be a particularly troop-heavy commitment. Periodic US-Turkish patrols are on the table, but the US proposal seems to place much more emphasis on air patrols, which would mean very little troop additional troop presence that we would need to implement this, which I think is the reason why we're designing it in that way, placing the emphasis on air, not on the ground.
Great. Well, we're running short on time, but we should get your concluding thoughts before we wrap up. Gonul, where do you see things going from here?
Well, as I said, there are many details left out, so we don't. We're not sure how moving forward how the implementation will go. But I think, as I said, there are just too many complications. And I think from a domestic view, which I think at the end of the day, this was for domestic purposes for Erdogan, he is very vulnerable, and whenever he's vulnerable, he uses the foreign policy to mobilize his base. He's done that in 2016, 1 month after the failed coup in Turkey. He launched Turkey's the first military incursion into northern Syria. And in 2018, right before critical local elections, he launched the second military incursion into Afrin, which is another Kurdish enclave. And that boosted his image at home. Even the opposition parties supported his move, but that was short-lived. As we saw in 2019 local elections, he lost the elections. So I think at the end of the day, if he's doing this to close the ranks at home and mobilize the base, it will only have a short-term effect. And it's not really going to change the trend against Erdogan at home. And I think it will have significant implications on the ground for other actors involved, and that could really test both Turkey-US ties and Turkey-Russian ties.
Charles, you've got the last word. What do you see happening next?
Essentially, I agree. The details still need to be figured out. I think we'll probably start to see some of these more easy to agree details being implemented, like the air patrols, for example. I think we'll start to hear public negotiation between the US and Turkey in the way that we've traditionally heard, threats, counter threats, proposals being made in public. And that will probably be the new norm, at least for the next few weeks, if not a few months, because I do think an intervention for now has been staved off. If you look back at the day the announcement was made, pro-Erdogan and Turkish state media were remarkably positive about it, despite the fact that there was no real deal made. And I think that tells us something, which is that in the end, they would much rather, at least for now, a deal that isn't really a deal, but that staves off an intervention, because an intervention does still carry with it huge risk. And for now, even though it's unappetizable in Ankara, a Manbij-like deal is enough of a compromise to settle some of the domestic concerns and the Syrian level concerns for now. They will wait to see how much things do change, and if an opportunity comes up in the future, maybe Turkey will grab that. Turkey doesn't only have the northeast to worry about. I mean, they are managing a crisis in northwestern Syria right now. They still have troops in northern Aleppo, and they're still combating the PKK in Turkey and in Iraq. So they can't focus all of their bandwidth on northeastern Syria. So in a way, I think this staves off things just as it does for the US, also for Turkey.
And also, I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to add this. I think this is important. Right after the announcement that Turkey and US reached a safe zone deal, the PKK's imprisoned leader Öcalan was allowed to see his lawyer. And the last time Turkey did that was right before Istanbul rerun elections, and that was an effort to woo the Kurdish votes. It didn't work. And then Öcalan sent a message to the Kurdish voters asking them to remain neutral. That didn't work either. So I think Turkey might be now hoping to use Öcalan to force the YPG to agree to the terms of the deal. But I think it's unlikely to work. The PKK is being squeezed by Turkish attacks in northern Iraq. Turkey's use of drones and some of the domestic measures taken to dismantle the Kurdish network there has dealt a huge blow to the PKK. So northern Syria is a big deal for the PKK. And I think that's why they would not easily give up on their gains there. And Öcalan would be putting his legitimacy at risk if he asked the YPG to agree to the terms without securing significant concessions from Turkey in return. So I think that is a risky move on Turkey's part too, and Öcalan's part.
A complicated situation, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on how things play out going forward, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there for today. Gonul, Charles, thank you both for joining the program.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.